Hello, welcome back. We are going to talk about something that we see clinically all the time, but also we see it in ourselves and our friends all the time, and that is worry. You've probably had the experience of your mind just spinning out of control, like looping the same thoughts over and over again, like you're trying to solve a problem, but nothing's really getting solved. Or you might have some worriers in your life, and it's like kind of hard to know what to do because you'd have these whole conversations with them, you try to reassure, and yet nothing really seems to get any better. So we actually just wanted to dedicate a whole episode to this because worry is a pretty interesting phenomenon, and I think it's a little bit deceitful. It's a little sneaky. If I had to personify worry, it would be this like little dragon on your shoulder that pokes you and says, listen to me, engage with me, dance with me. I'm going to save you. I'm going to protect you. So you have to worry. You have to. But actually, it doesn't really protect you at all. At least once it gets into the realm of like that looping, constant rumination worry. So anyway, Kibby, what would you say about worry?
The worry dragon's an old friend of mine. He and I go way back. Probably if I were to trace it around 6 years old, my parents divorced. Worry is really interesting, and you see it with pretty much everyone, right? It's every time, most of my sessions when I start out, it doesn't matter what disorder someone has or what they're struggling with. Sessions often start with the worry, like, oh, this person said this, and what do I do? And this, I got this email and this text, and I don't know what to do, and this could happen and this could happen, but I could do this, right? It feels like just like a bundle of nerves kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And when the worry mind really takes over, it kind of twists on itself where it actually, I see that it really stops people from acting and stops people from feeling and doing. It's kind of like locks people in. Of course, it is most common in anxiety because a lot of worrying often is driven by anxiety, of fears. And when worry, the reason why we have worry, I mean, it's not for nothing. It's the reason why we have worrying is that it is a coping strategy. It is a defense against something. So when we are afraid of a threat and we're afraid of a worst case scenario or outcome, our minds tend to worry in order to prepare for that negative outcome, right? It makes us plan. It makes us even think about what can go wrong and figure out a plan of attack or how to prevent it or cope with it, right? So when worry is like working, we go, something bad's going to happen. Here's what I would do about it. And let's start doing that proactively, right? Humans can do that because we have like a sense of time. Animals don't tend to do that, right? Like I see my dog and she is free of worry because she has no sense of the future. She's not planning for anything. So we have worrying for a reason, but it tends to, if it kind of goes into hyperdrive, it actually can backfire and make us not plan effectively or not really see reality or sometimes even create the problems that we're worrying about. So,
yeah, I guess I would distinguish helpful worry from unhelpful worry by calling helpful worry problem solving. If something has just happened, if there's a threat, of course it makes sense to problem solve around it. But I think when it goes into the land of worry, there's this sense that you're avoiding the emotion, which oftentimes can come with feelings of like uncontrollability. Like the worrying is an attempt to exert control that you just might not have after a certain point. Do you know how to tell when you've reached worry versus problem solving? Like it's become unhelpful?
I know personally, and I think that the emotional avoidance you're talking about is really key. That is a coping strategy too. Worrying is like a defense against some painful emotions you might not want to feel, or against a painful reality. Like in order to think about the future, you're not thinking about the present and what actually happened. So for me, I know that I'm not helpful. It's going into an unhelpful worry territory when my thoughts are looping, like it's going over the same one, and whatever solutions I get to don't feel satisfying, and I just keep going over, but what if. Often for me, this is personally, and I also see this in patients a lot in people, but it's because there's something about the reality or my present emotions that I don't want to feel. For me, it's like, you know, when I going through a breakup, a loss, a sadness, that feeling of sadness and pain, it feels so awful because I can't do anything about it. I'm like such a doer, you know me. I'm such a doer that sadness is just about sitting with it and, you know, like taking time. But worrying and anxiety can be really proactive. Like, I'm thinking about what I can do. I can think about what can happen in the future. It's like, it feels very active and problem solving to me. But that's a trick of my mind that tends to do that. So I can avoid feeling that kind of like helpless vulnerability.
Yeah. One thing I heard recently from a patient was that it felt like, because we're you know, talking about like not worrying, trying to cut off that that process before it gets too far, is that it feels irresponsible to not worry. Like, if you worry, then that's gonna protect you, your family. And I thought that was great insight, because it's exactly, I think, how it feels a lot of time. Like, you're talking about worrying, like it's proactive, like you're doing something. And when you're sitting with that anxiety, and in a situation that maybe it feels like you can control some elements of it, but others you can't, like the future, it can feel irresponsible to just sit there and not think about it. Not continue that problem-solving loop attempt. And so I think that's really interesting, because it's so hard to convince people that it's actually probably more responsible to just not worry.
The controllability piece is huge, because with all these, I mean, for me, I just said like my present feeling of sadness, but also this future uncertainty, right? If we don't know if something bad's going to happen, even just inserting a potential bad future and then ruminating and worrying over it feels like you're controlling it. And it's this illusion of control when it feels like I can't possibly open up to the possibility that I have no control over the situation and I can't stop it. And it could really be a good trick, because let's say that thing doesn't happen. Like, that horrible outcome doesn't happen. I have some patients who said, where they worry about something happening, and then the next week I'm like, did it happen? And they go, no, but I feel like it's because I worried about it and really like planned for it that it didn't happen, right? So like you could have those kind of like erroneous cause and effect, where it's like, because I worried, the thing didn't happen or wasn't as bad, or even if it did happen, thank goodness that I knew it, right? You got the I told you so satisfaction of like, I controlled it because I predicted it. So
I mean, so I used to have a lot of flight anxiety, and I flew all the time. So, I mean, I wasn't avoiding, but what I realized I was avoiding, I was doing emotional avoidance in this really absurd way. And I think once I was able to verbalize it, I was able to let it go some. But what I realized I was doing was I was making myself anxious the entire flight, and I wouldn't let myself let go of that anxiety. And I realized and I'm not religious, but I was making like a deal with God almost, to be like, okay, if you don't strike this plane down, I'll do my part by making myself miserable the entire time. So it was almost like not wanting to be caught a fool, like not wanting to just be sitting there and enjoying myself, and then like not being prepared for when the worst would happen. It was just totally absurd. But I think worry can creep in, and this need for control can creep in really unusual ways that can be hard to locate at first. Because that's not like, that example, like, I don't even believe in God, and yet I was making deals with God, like just to have some sort of illusion of control. And so I think verbalizing that kind of gave me the power to say, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. Like, it doesn't make any sense. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to stop. But in general, I mean, have you figured out ways to stop worrying? Do we know strategies to end this cycle?
In myself,
I mean, I'm terrible too.
I'm a work in progress, as we all are. I think with my patients, and I try to do this to myself as well, it's like really think about what's going on, right? It's like if I'm defending against something, what is that thing I'm defending against? And I get at that, I think I get at that myself and my patients, like, what am I actually feeling right now? And really getting out of my head, because my head is just looping. And so I can get into a little bit more of my body, like, what am I actually feeling emotionally right now? Okay, it's probably fear, but then what am I afraid of? And what does that mean, right? Like, sometimes the actual worry can give you a clue of what you really care about. If I'm worried about someone judging me, or I'm worrying about someone rejecting me, what I'm actually feeling is that, like, I really care about keeping this relationship. I really care about this person and wanting them to be in my life, and I'm scared of losing them. Or any other kind of worries, like of safety. You know, when people we're worried constantly about COVID, it's like, I'm worried about my safety. I'm worried about my life. I'm worried about losing my losing my children, right? Like, you kind of get a clue of what you care about. And then if I'm really in a good place and with some good friends, or, you know, I could kind of get into some underlying, like, sadness or something, some other kind of emotion. So, you know, kind of going there. The thing that doesn't help is, and this is going into a little bit of if you have a loved one who worries a lot. And I hear this a lot with my patients, especially their spouses, where they are constantly, my patients will, like, worry at them, right? They'll be like, what about this? What about that? What about this? And the spouses in all good intentions will reassure them, right? No, that's not going to happen. Don't worry, you'll be fine. We got this, right? Which might calm them down in the moment, but the worry comes back. And then the loved one feels really helpless. So kind of recognizing that just, like, staying in the worry and reassuring the worry doesn't actually help. So yeah, that's one big piece. What about you? You also have worked with this in yourself and in clinically. Did you find anything helpful for yourself? Or?
I mean, what's been helpful for myself is SSRIs. So,
yeah, that's not a small thing. Yeah. Big plug for med management. Yeah.
One of the interventions I use is the Unified Protocol, which is a transdiagnostic treatment, meaning it can treat people with all sorts of different emotional disorders. It's not, like, targeted at a particular disorder. But that being said, I would still say it was mostly developed for anxiety. And, you know, the skills that we teach in the UP are skills that you use all the time, skills we use in other therapies. But the two big ones, I mean, first we like to talk about, what we just did here, which is, like, talk about the function of the emotion, talk about, like, what avoiding that emotion can do. And there are real negatives to avoiding the emotion. You may teach yourself through avoiding it that it's something you can't handle. If you're avoiding feeling sadness by worrying, you're teaching yourself, if sadness isn't something I can handle, every time I feel sad, I need to reach for something, reach for a distraction. And that can take away a lot of your self-efficacy. And so, you know, we talk a lot about that. And then some skills we use are mindfulness. And, you know, we've already done an episode on this, so you can check that out. But what that really does is it gets you grounded in the present moment. And you kind of cut off these legs of thought that you're likely to have, which is one, judging yourself. And what I notice is that worry is often so mingled with judgment, ego, shame. Like, you know, I might be saying to myself, okay, I know I've got my master's thesis coming up, and I, you know, don't feel like I'm good enough. I can't handle it. I don't know how to do data analysis. I don't know how to do all these things. I'm going to crash and burn. Everything's going to be terrible. And, you know, a lot of that is really self-deprecating. And it's like, okay, hold on a second. Is any of that self-deprecation going to help me? Probably not. Like, it, you know, me telling me I suck it's not going to be useful at all. It's not part of the problem solving. Me telling myself I'm going to fail out of my PhD program is also just not going to help the situation at hand. So you really kind of get clear on, like, what is useful for me to think about right now? Let's get back to actual problem solving instead of spinning out instead of just having thoughts just because you're avoiding the actual emotion. And you can tell having those thoughts is probably actually just going to make you feel worse. It's going to make me feel worse to tell myself I suck and I'm stupid and et cetera, et cetera. And so really kind of paring back and getting to what can I do in the moment that is actually useful. And that's a really, really different from worry, because a lot of what it might entail is recognizing when I don't have control. Like, okay, here's a piece. It feels really bad. It feels really scary, but there's nothing I can do about it. There's no problem solving that's going to help me with this piece. And so maybe that's where this mindfulness component comes in, just getting centered, having some acceptance, and dealing with the situation at hand the best that you can do, or the best that you can. And that's really hard to do because it involves giving yourself permission to cut off these thought processes. Which again can feel almost irresponsible. It can feel like you're losing control, but in fact, you're gaining control because you're dealing with the problem and not allowing yourself to go in a 5 million unhealthy directions. And the other big one we would use is cognitive flexibility, which we can talk about in a second. I don't want to go in a big monologue, but I guess the third then is exposure. So if you're worried, if you're terrified of something, if you're worried about, maybe you're like agoraphobic, you're worried about going outside, going in crowds, it's just actually like taking the steps to get yourself back out there so you can prove to yourself that what you're really worried about is unlikely to happen, and that even if it did, you could find a way to cope with it. So that's kind of 3.
That's nice. I love that. That was one of the things I was thinking about, the exposure to what happens if it does happen. Because a lot of exposure in therapy is about showing the person that the thing that they're afraid of is unlikely to happen, as you said. But then our anxiety, worry mind, little dragon will say like, well, what if it does? What if you had that 1% chance that horrible thing happens? And in therapy, I tend to lean into that, and really talk to patients about, okay, let's walk through that worst case scenario. Sometimes we'll do a worst case scenario script. We'll write down or verbalize, like, what is that worst case scenario in painful detail, right? So often anxiety minds are not so thorough. They actually... we think, I've looped over that worst case scenario all day, every day. But when you actually talk about it or write it out, you realize that anxiety minds don't do that. They just go, what if the plane crashes? Or what if what if that person rejects me and I'm all alone? But in order to, it doesn't actually flesh out that reality. It doesn't go, okay, I will walk into this room, I'll talk to this person, I will say this, they'll make a funny face, they'll never speak to me again, right? All those details we don't flesh out. And then when we do in session, either written or verbal, then the most important part is, okay, and then what? How would you cope with that? That person hates you and doesn't speak to you ever again. What's your next step? Who do you turn to talk to? What do you do? Do you reach out to them? Do you just die alone? What does it actually look like? And even the worst case scenarios that people have given, at least even just fleshing out that worst case scenario in all of its gritty detail, there's some relief in that, because ultimately if it's so bad, it's like a meteor will hit the earth and we'll all die. It's like, well, then there's nothing to worry about, because what are you going to do, right? Or people go, oh, actually, if I'll say something to someone at a party, they tell everyone stops being my friend, and I have 0 friends and I'm all alone. Well, that is an extreme scenario that we know it's unlikely, but it's like, what would you do? And people actually come up with, they surprise themselves with what they could come up with when they are really there, are really at that worst case scenario that it would be like the most awful thing ever. But then what happens the next day? Well, I have no friends, and I will, join a meetup group, or maybe I'll be alone and, commit to being a loner and get a bunch of cats and travel the world and have no friends, but I'll also have no connection. So I'll live free, on the road, right? It's like, actually, anxiety minds, or when worrying is not helpful, it really stops before the actual coping. It just goes, oh no, what if? Oh no, what if? Oh no, what if? But then really talking it through is like, okay, let's go there. And for loved ones who are trying to help, they want to, if like you have a loved one who worries a lot, you might be afraid of going there with them because that's the thing that they're terrified. So you want to reassure, no, that won't happen. We'll be fine. But then, actually that's avoidance too. It's like, what if it's not fine? Well, walking through what that would look like, actually it's its own exposure and its own coping mechanism that could be more effective.
Okay, wait. So what's one thing you've been worrying about?
Okay, yeah. A real worry of mine is that I won't be able to have my own biological children. I talked about this in the last episode, but I have been going through, we were trying for 2 years with my husband and going through IVF and other kinds of fertility treatments. And I had my mind for a lot of that process wasn't going there. It just was like, okay, well, I have to make the doctor's appointment. And then what? And what kind of medications? I don't want to do that, blah, blah, blah. So it just was loop, loop, loop. And my worry script would be, okay, like I try IVF a bunch of times. I try all sorts, everything that modern science has to be able to have a biological children. It's like, okay, well, in that case, I would look at donor eggs. Okay. And then I would look at donor sperm and what if those don't work? Okay, playing that out. Then I would look at adoption. What if I can't do that? Well, I will, let's say I can't have children at all. That would be even farther in the worst case scenario. My mind wouldn't even go there.
Right. Well, as your friend, like how would I help if you were, if you're getting into this worry script right now? Like, so instead of saying it's going to be okay, like I know that you can handle this. I know that you're going to figure this out. What should I say instead? What would be helpful to stop the worry?
Yeah, I think as a friend, of course, like you'd be like, don't worry about it. You're going to be crying, right? Yeah. But I think if you validated my emotions, like that is terrifying. That is really, would be so painful that I've been having, you've been having issues. I mean, validating the emotions that I'm feeling. Yeah. And, kind of maybe just, disengaging a little bit from my, like, okay, I have to make the doctor, blah, 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 all my details of my worrying and be like, it seems like you're really scared about all this, very disappointed and very sad about this, not being able to have a child yet. And I get that it's scary that you don't know what's going to happen. Right. So validating that my present, what I'm trying to avoid probably right now is just like the pain and loss of this not working. And the fear of the uncertainty that I don't know how to have a child. Right. And then if, kind of staying there until I could kind of settle down and kind of disengage from my own details of my worrying. And then just saying, okay, well, what if you get that news? What if you get the news that you can't have a biological child? What would you do? What would you want to do? What are your options? Okay. Right. And kind of gently going through that. I think in therapy, we go a little bit more like, this is what we're doing. We're kind of playing coping. There's some framing around like, let's go in there. But as a friend, gently saying, okay, what will be next? What would be next? And even doing that, you're giving the support that if this horrible outcome were to happen, you're there with me, right? Instead of just dismissing it, because my mind is already there. But I would want someone to be there by my side and love me and care for me and support me, even if that horrible thing happened, right? So it's just kind of like holding me in that space.
Yeah, it's interesting because, what I find in therapy so often is I feel like I'm often walking a tightrope between two very similar concepts, and I feel like I slip sometimes. Like, in this case, it's like you don't want to co-ruminate, you don't want to engage the worry too much, and asking these questions can feel like, well, isn't that engaging the worry? Like, it feels so similar to co-ruminating, but I guess I can see the difference if I'm imagining myself in this situation. Is like, normally when someone reassures, that's a little tiny reward that gets me to keep spewing. Like, they say everything's going to be okay. I'm like, okay, but like, what if, because I kind of want to get that nugget of like, yeah, everything will be okay. Okay, you'll help me. I'll get, instead of this, which is a little bit more of direct problem solving and I guess like grappling with a situation at hand instead of just like, I don't know, throwing it all at the wall. But it just feels like a delicate balance that it might be hard to like parse out when you are helping versus when you are instead co-ruminating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I don't think it's like every time someone worries, be like, okay, what's the worst case scenario? And like, what is, and how are you going to deal with it? Because it's probably going to happen, right? Or like, what are you feeling right now? Right? I mean, like as a loved one, I just see it visually. It's like if I'm worrying and like walking by myself and trying to so desperately to figure out the path forward and find a path out of this forest, like you coming to walk next to me for a little bit and kind of like looking around, being like, oh my God, I don't know where we're going. Like kind of just empathizing and being there. Sometimes, and this is my clinical style, so that's different, but I will engage a little bit, like, okay, then what? Oh my God, what's in your mind? What are you thinking about? And just being there and listening, and maybe asking questions to kind of get those worry details out. And then I redirect to like the feeling and kind of like validating their feelings and making sure that I'm there with them. Right. Yeah. And then really like turning it into effective problem solving of, okay, like that. Yeah, you're right. The plane might crash. I might not have a biological child, like might be rejected and be totally alone. Like then what? But I'm here with you in that, even in this conversation. Right. So yeah, no right or wrong answer. I think I always kind of lean into like, empathizing and being there with them. And sometimes that looks like co-ruminating, but you're not going to stay there. You're not going to stay in the worry content and like, okay, well, this will happen and this might happen but it'll all be fine. Don't worry. Right. It's like, it's, I don't know. I could more just feel it, but it kind of just in my mind, it's like walking next to that person and then holding their hand through that process.
Yeah. The other thing I noticed from what you were saying is that you didn't fall into the trap of something this is gendered, but something I think men do a lot, and I do it a lot, but immediately going to problem solving, like where I'm the problem solver and the warrior is sort of just sitting there accepting my advice. That tends to go pretty poorly, I think, most of the time, because what often happens is that you don't feel met or heard. It's just, you're accepting these pieces of advice that your worry mind has probably already churned out. And so it's like, no, that's not helpful. I've already thrown that suggestion in the garbage in my worry mind. Like you're just spitting back at me things I've already rejected in a sense. Or it can make them feel like, oh yeah, it's just that simple, huh? Well then what's wrong with me? Like I can't do that. If I was that simple, I would have already done it. So then that can lead to more judgment. And so this instead is more like asking questions, leading the person down their own route of problem solving instead of providing nuggets of advice.
That's a really good point. And I think that, even as we're saying the difference between effective problem solving and worrying, a loved one would often reassure or give advice, right? Like, why don't you just do this? And, and as you're saying, that's helpful because their mind is already churning out. But it's also missing the point, which is if that person's in a place of unhelpful worrying, it's driven by emotions that are not being addressed, right? It's a defense against something. The worrying is kind of like, flutter on top of what's actually happening, which is they're feeling terrified, they're feeling alone, they're feeling sad, they're feeling scared, right? And just staying on that upper level and trying to bring them into effective problem solving is if the emotions are super high, it's going to fall really flat. Yeah. And so really so as a loved one, keeping that difference in mind when you're seeing that your loved one is like ruminating and worrying to unhelpful, really ineffective way, know that there's something going on underneath, and maybe just get there and love them and care for them and validate their emotions on that different level. No, it's hard, but like,
I'm gonna make Paul listen to this episode.
Yeah, I mean, because it's like it is so easy for someone on the outside to be like, oh, it will be fine, or here's a solution, right? Like, if you're not in the emotional space, you can see the reality of the situation, the worst case scenario, and how to prevent it or cope with it, right? Like, in our logical minds, it's easy, but that person is not there. That person is feeling a really intense emotion that they're trying to defend against. So you're just throwing, like rocks at a shield, right? So it's just like kind of disengage from that.
Yeah. It also sounds like what you've been talking about is cognitive flexibility, which we could do an entire episode on this. But a lot of times what happens when people worry is they kind of get into a narrow path of that worry, where it's like, I mean, I've had patients who just literally can't visualize other outcomes. They can't realize that actually they might be capable of handling whatever's going to come their way, that they've in fact handled similar things in the past, that, things might turn out in a different way than they expect. And maybe that's part of the feeling of irresponsibility, is like, I have to imagine the worst case scenario. Like, I have to shield myself against something bad. And in that way, it's like the positives or the other possibilities don't even have a chance to come in.
Yeah, and it's as you're talking, sorry to cut you off on a point. As you're talking too, and we've been talking about control and things like that. It's just the way you're discussing it, it's like, it kind of reminds me of like when there's this child in you that is so scared of something bad happening, but doesn't feel the capabilities to handle it, right? And so there's like the vulnerability piece of like, I can't control this, and it's going to be horrible. And I think that's why we've had so many useful structures of giving up acceptance and giving up control to a higher power or being, even if that's like a parent figure or if that's religion, right? Like giving up something to prayer or a higher power in the, the AA terms, or Alcoholics Anonymous, or I think there's a lot of relief in that. It's hard when someone doesn't have that, but if someone does have access to that, it can remind us that, like, we don't have, as a human being, we don't have control over everything. And it is relieving for me to sometimes think about, like, and I talked about this in the fertility episode of, like, yeah, I can do a million things to control my fertility, like go to doctors, eat this, do that, right? But ultimately, like, some people say that, your baby's out there, or motherhood is kind of like this miracle that I don't have control over, and what will happen, right? There's almost this kind of like something greater than me and my control that is also at play, and I have to kind of like accept and submit my need for control to that. And I do feel, and that does actually soothe my worries a little bit, because it's a little bit like, I don't need to worry as much. There's something else that's gonna that it's in something else's hands. Yeah.
It's cool having not been raised religious, now like studying psychology and seeing how much religion got right.
There's a reason why we had it, or have it.
Okay, so kind of concretely, if your friend is worrying, you validate the emotion, try to kind of find it, meet them there, and then just be the person who demonstrates that they will walk with them through that worry, through that path. And
maybe not offer solutions, but help that person generate their own solutions by discussing, like, okay, if that happened, what would you do? What, and how can I support you in that, right? I think that's a difference between advice giving and then talking about like coping and effective problem solving. It's like supporting their efficacy and handling the situation. There's also one more trick. If for yourself, if you or your loved one is, worrying constantly, there's an interesting trick of containing the worry, which is, so it's called a worry box. And And the idea behind the worry box is that you make a box, literally a box or some kind of container, where if you find yourself worrying throughout the day, you write that worry down on a piece of paper and put it in that box. And then you give yourself like a set time, an hour, like 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. That's your worry time. That's when you go into the box, open the box, and look at your worries. And if it's something you can actually do something about, like if there's actually a problem-solving solution to that, you write that down and you're going to do that. Mm-hmm. If you can't, then you just put it back in the box, right? And just say, it's in my worry box. And then you do that for the rest of the day. And the reason why you do that is just to make it a little bit more effective, where it's like, okay, first of all, just writing out your worries, like getting it out from your head to a piece of paper is huge. But it's not allowing yourself to worry throughout the day, so it interferes with your other thoughts or your functioning in your life. Mm-hmm. But then it kind of turns it to a little more effective of like, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to pay attention to these worries, and can I actually cope with this? Can I actually plan and do something and then be proactive about it? So it's kind of like the same strategy as like, don't read your emails at all times throughout the day, but like have an email time, right? So, people use that and they actually find that, if they're really like, my worry mind is going haywire, at least giving some boundaries over that, and make a cool little box with decorate it, put the little picture of the dragon on it or something like that, So.
Yeah, I mean, and diffusion techniques, like you can make that worry thought, you can paint it, put glitter all over it, make it super pretty, and carry it around with you all day. So it's like, I've always got my worry thought here. Like, I haven't left it at home. It's here, but I can go about my day.
Yeah.
And not let it control me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, this was actually a really fun episode for me to record. Worry is becoming one of my favorite topics because we just see it all the time, and it's something everybody can relate to. So on that note, Kibby, do you have a resource for us? And then we'll close out.
Yeah, the book that I really like is called The Worry Cure, 7 Steps to Stop Worry from Stopping You, by Robert Leahy. So I'll put that on the website. It kind of covers a lot of the different topics that we talked about, but a little bit more in depth. So check out that book. It's great.
Awesome. Okay, guys, we will see you again next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.